Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. It's always a pleasure for me to review one of Derek Roebuck's books. They are first-class works of scholarship and very interesting to read, and it is amazing how much work Derek has put in to the quite formidable library of works that he's now produced. We're looking this morning at a book that he's come up with on arbitration and mediation in 17th century England, and it's published by HOLO Books, I think it's pronounced, and the Arbitration Press in Oxford. Elizabeth and I went to the book launch and met Derek, and it was a most interesting evening. And can I say that the title we've given this particular book is quite topical at the moment. We've said, quote, "There is no law to warrant tortures in this land." The 17th century speaks to today as revealed in this latest book by Derek Roebuck, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. Let's have a look at the book first. Here it is, lovely cover. Very much the house style of HOLO Books. There's the spine and then there's the back. You can probably see the detail of what he actually says in his blurb. Now, there's some information about previous books which are on the inside back cover, and there's a picture of Derek there and some detail about his very distinguished background. And then the book itself, you've got right at the back, it's running to 500 odd pages. You've got a very useful index there. Then you've got, in addition to that, very substantial bibliography. And if we go from the bibliography, which starts there, you've then got, in addition to that, a chronology, which I think is quite helpful. We probably all remember bits of the 17th century, but not all, and it does help. I think it puts it into the picture nicely. What I did find helpful is the glossary, because what you're dealing with here, you're dealing with quite a lot of terms which may not be familiar to people today. So I think the glossary is quite helpful. These are the books that Derek has written in the past, and this is actually the current front title. And then there's a nice dedication, which I will just show you. The book's published in 2017, and that's the copyright for it. That's the dedication there. And then you've got the background and the various structure headings. Part 1, background. Part 2, substance. Land, of course, featuring. Part 3, people. Part 4, arbitration and the law, looking to where it fits in, and Part 5, conclusions. And it runs to 21 chapters in total, with the 2 appendices at the back, and then a very useful preface with a quote from Shakespeare. And as I say, it's a particularly good book. It's very well written, and a pleasure to review. Pleasure to read and a pleasure to review. Gives you an idea of what's in. There are a few little footnotes at the bottom, but the body copy, and some subheads, of course, with numbering, but the body copy is there to read and sort of flow through nicely. Now, what do we say? It seems that any number of things that we hold dear in the 21st century came to fruition in the 17th, from the scientific method to insurance policies to the proliferation of coffee houses, in which deal-making was the order of the day. Much of the rich tapestry of life in the 17th century then in England is startlingly revealed by Derek Roebuck in this, the latest title in his series on arbitration and mediation. In other words, that means dispute resolution through the ages. Interestingly, it appears that arbitration and mediation, rather than going to court, was the preferred method in the 17th century for the settlement of quarrels and disputes. By reading this book, you can find out why this was so, as events and personalities are illuminated, one after the other, in rich and lively detail. When the century was new, for example, Queen Elizabeth I wrote to the Lord Mayor of London, telling him not to meddle in a dispute over insurance, quote, "as he was prone to do, so by means of fictions." She had no use for the common law, courts and their technicalities and delays, says the author. She wanted to promote trade, not fee lawyers. I wonder where we've heard that more recently. Intolerant of any further nonsense, the Queen got Francis Bacon to introduce legislation which in 1601 provided a permanent arbitration commission to have every cause concerning policies of assurance in a brief and summary course, as to their discretion shall seem met, without formalities of pleadings of proceedings. So I've got that slightly wrong there, but that is the gist of the quote. The commission, however, comprised 2 doctors of civil law and 2 common lawyers, as well as the Admiralty Judge, the Recorder of London, and 8 grave and discreet merchants. Thus the book provides fascinating insights into the social attitudes and the temper of the time during what was a turbulent period in English history. And, for instance, the chapter on Edward Coke, the Lord Chief Justice, contains much that is curiously relevant to a number of controversies that plague us today. And Coke, as it's actually written out, which is pronounced Cook, was a brilliant but to some flawed character, and he was a prolific writer who had more influence on the development of the common law, asserts the author, than anyone before or since. He was fundamentally against hanging and insisted that torture was against the law of England, even though it continued to be carried out at the time under certain controls. And there are some interesting comments about that. The reason I mention it is because of the raising of this subject matter internationally at the moment. There is no law to warrant tortures in this land, Cook wrote, and there is no one opinion in our books or judicial record that we have seen or remember for the maintenance of tortures. The current President of the United States and some of his supporters perhaps should take some note of this. In brisk and compelling prose, supported by numerous references to original sources, the author continues to enlighten not only academics, lawyers and the judiciary, of course, but the general reader, and yes, arbitrators and mediators whose strategies and methods are somewhat underrated these days. I know there's a huge amount of pressure in certain quarters to use this, what we call alternative dispute resolution, ADR, but in some cases it's not actually the right way to do it. But I can see why we are pressured into trying to consider it, and I'll leave it at that. Let me conclude by saying researchers especially will appreciate the wealth of references cited in the extensive footnoting and in the astonishingly lengthy bibliography. A huge amount of work has gone into this, and Derek must be thanked. He must have got a lot of help too, I think, but clearly most of it comes directly from him, and it's a wonderful piece of scholarship. And at the back of the book there's a handy glossary, and please note the chronology, which lists key intellectual, legal and political developments on both sides of the Atlantic, which together shaped the modern world. And as I say, the publication date is cited as at 2017. Let's look at the book again. Very much the house style for HOLO books. There's the spine, and then at the back you've got quite a lot of basic information. I do like the picture, I must say, on the front, which really does get the flavour of the Stuarts, I think, to quite a treat. Let's just open the book in the middle. We've got the diarists. Now that was a period, of course, when a lot of people wrote diaries, and we all know some of the very famous ones. And there's one mentioned. Now, I don't know how he pronounced his name. Richard Cholmeley. Probably Richard Chumley. It's difficult to know how some of them would have pronounced their names at that time, but we've got a large number, and you can see again a lot of extracts are included to make particular points. There's an interesting point on page 339 of women, and he talks about Milton. So just remembering your history, arbitration and mediation at this particular time, 1600 to 1700 in England, a vast change, the Civil War, a huge number of things happening. I think it's a fascinating read, as have all of Derek's books. I'd like to thank Derek very much for the work he's done. It was a pleasure to meet him the other day too. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.